Appreciate the interactivity. We're going to move, in the interest of time, straight on to our next presentation with Rob Webb, who is the CEO of AFAC. Rob was appointed CEO of the Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council, AFAC, in December 2021. Rob is an experienced leader in the emergency management industry, 26 years also at the Bureau of Meteorology. He is a former deputy CEO there, where he led the Bureau's state and national multi-hazard service delivery during some of Australia's worst disaster events. He specialised in extreme weather services from the mid-90s, and since then has forged very strong partnerships with the emergency management sector at local level as well as state and Commonwealth. I asked Rob to tell me something else about him that has nothing whatsoever to do with work and that is not in his work bio. And he wrote to me and said, quote, "Andrew, I'm constantly living with a weather illness. I remain a closeted prognosticator of I can't even say the word, meteorological phenomena, like most firefighters I met in my forecasting career. I spent most of my life watching and playing rugby. My 2016 move to Melbourne saw me develop the Southern AFL illness. The Mighty Tigers have delivered 3 grand final wins and a heap of heartache since then. Funnily enough, a lovely metaphor for my forecasting career." So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man that puts the meat into meteorology, Rob Webb. Rob, over to you.
All I can say is, oh my God, following a Navy pilot, how could you make meteorology or AFAC exciting? But look, it's fantastic to be here. And I was talking to people before this session, and I said, look, if the person before me is great, then I've got no pressure on me. If they're really bad, I'll look really good. But as I'm watching Kate speak, I'm going, oh no, I'm in trouble. But look, I'm really, really happy to talk to you today. I had eye-opening when I first joined AFAC, because I didn't have a lot to do with AFAC before I came across. And I was speaking to a couple of RFS volunteers at a launch of one of the planes, aerial firefighting planes, and they hadn't heard of AFAC. They didn't know who we were and didn't have a clue. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because there's so much we have to offer. And it was really great when Scott and Sharon reached out and said, "Do you want to come along and talk to the RFSA conference?" And I jumped at it, because I just get so much energy from speaking to this group. I get so much energy and ideas from how much more we can do, because we connect across every state and territory in Australia and across New Zealand as well. And it doesn't matter where we go and what we look at. It's really amazing to understand how common some of the challenges are and just how much there is that we can learn from each other. And I just love the passion and that sense of, wow, gee, we can do things differently. So I want to talk a little bit today about who we are, this thing called the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services, some of the things we do and the projects we've got on the boil at the moment, some of the things where we need to do better as a sector, and some of the things that we think that are going okay as well, and the projects that are exciting me. And like as was said in the introduction, I'm a washed up meteorologist. Spent a lot of time. I cut my teeth here in New South Wales, where I came off I call it weather school in about 1993 during the 93-94 bushfires. That was my first taste of meteorology and forecasting, and then through the 97 fires here in the 2000, 01, 02, 02, 03 and onwards, I just recognised the severity of the weather across all hazards here in New South Wales. And then I went up to Queensland and ran the Queensland operation for a while. And again, they do weather pretty well up there as well. In the sort of rainfall that you see there in 6 hours, it's jaw dropping. But here I am, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those experiences today, I hope. So often people think, and when different our member agencies talk about AFAC, they grumble about this small little office sitting in East Melbourne. Bloody AFAC, they'll say. But AFAC at its heart is actually the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services. There's a group of the top 33 emergency management leaders in the country come together twice a year and talk about common issues and areas of that they feel that they should come together as a group and address. So this National Council, which is across land managers, rural fire, urban fire, SESs, Surf Life Saving New South Wales, come together, and they want to come together. I remember speaking to the previous a minister for emergency services in the federal minister. And she says, I have never found a sector like this, that the federated states want to work together so much. And we'll talk a little bit about that today as just why that's important. And you will see why that's important. 340 people at the end of next week will be in Canada. We'll give you a sense of why it's important that we're working together, because we need to support each other in the worst times and the best times. We've refocused our strategy as a new CEO comes in and says, well, I think we've got to do some change. And I turned the focus back on our membership and said, we need to understand the member. We need to understand who it is that we're serving in this little East Melbourne office. I can't give you a video of me walking out of the office and getting a paper cut and, that is anything like what Kate just presented. But I reckon the fear of walking into a room full of angry commissioners might come close to landing a helicopter. But so there's 33 members, as I mentioned, and 25 affiliates, which we try and gather other sectors as well that come in and can help us. So we might have some of the Pacific Island nations are affiliates that can have common issues, or Department of Primary Industries who deal in emergency management. And we gather them into this deep collaboration network and hopefully put on events for them that are useful. I mentioned this, the funny thing about our federation is that everyone does it differently. If I look at in the space of about a week last year, Queensland announced that they were de-amalgamating QFES into a fire and an emergency services. At the same time, Tasmania released a review that said they should bang their fire and emergency services together and create TFES. So there is different things and different both history and good reason that agencies are either together or apart, and it just depends on it. It's got to meet the local flavour, and that's something that we at AFAC respect deeply. And you heard the minister this morning saying he's not chasing any amalgamation. That works here. Anytime that we step outside our role as a supporter and a facilitator, we're in trouble. But so the land managers, and it was effectively the urban, 1993, we're in our 30th year, the urban fire associations and the rural fire associations got together and said, well, we've both got these associations, let's join together and form the Australian Fire Authorities Council. That included land managers as well. New Zealand came on pretty quickly after it, so it became Australasian. And then over the next 10 or 15 years, AFAC was born and grew to the point that the SESs came in, and then it had to become the Australasian Fire and Emergency Services Council, but the brand is there. So when people say, what does AFAC stand for? It's the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services with a silent NC and the rest of it. But if you look at all of those, that's 200, nearly 300,000 strong workforce and $5.5 billion in expenditure. As I will say to our council sometimes, it would be nice to get a little more of that $5.5 billion, but there is so much money that's going into this sector, and there's too much money for us not to be working together and leveraging off each other, both the urban fire and rescue, the rurals, the SESs. There's so much because you're working with each other at the worst times. You're trying to speak a common language. So what we're trying to do here is bring that through and focus on the most things. They're our members. If you think about acronyms, there's a lot of them, and you can just get a sense of the very different approaches from different states. In Queensland, we've only got 2 members, Parks and Wildlife and QFES at the moment. Next year it'll be 3. New South Wales, it's got RFS, SES, National Parks, New South Wales Forestry, Fire and Rescue, Surf Lifesaving New South Wales now. And as I say to my wife who works for Lifesaving Victoria, when you become a real emergency service, you can join AFAC. But that's a really broad church of membership. And trying to be one thing that we over time that we have tried to do by being everything to everyone, you find that you're not much to anybody. So we're trying to get these common threads through and make sure that we recognise the collective, draw a thread through where people have common views on how they operate and how they should operate. But at the same time, don't forget that our rural fires have specific things that are causing them challenges, or our urbans or our SESs, and make sure that we can focus down into those as well and provide that value back for the investment that they give us. And hopefully that in turn goes through into the various communities. And trying to get this sense of multiple different agencies working, 33 agencies working for different political masters of different sides of politics with either a paid workforce, a volunteer workforce, but all having essential workforces. Trying to get this common view of what are the most important things is pretty difficult. And they came up with this idea after going through strategic plans, talking to leadership within all these agencies. What are the big issues that you're going to be looking at and you and your workforces are going to be looking at in the coming years? What can we best do to help? And this is what they came up with, 6 major areas over the next 4 to 5 years that they will be, that need focus. Now, underneath all of this is this richness of information, supporting resilient communities. There's no one that has seen the disasters in recent years, in the recent decades, that haven't seen the value of strong, resilient communities and our need to engage with those and all of those different areas that are working with those resilient communities. For once, as a sector, we need to sit in the community and look back out and think about what they're seeing and all the different groups that they're seeing and look back out at that. And that's something that it's tricky because it's a mixed space. But when we try and talk to the federal government, for instance, we will say that there are very, very few sectors that have so many of their people, not just in the community or not with offices in the community, but they are part of that community. They live in the community and serve that community. And that's the real value of having a 200,000 or 250,000 strong emergency service volunteer workforce in Australia, is that they're part of that resilient community and can work with other areas and other leaders in the sector, other leaders in those communities to bring about change. Because we know that disasters over time, they are going to overwhelm, are going to get bigger than we can handle in local, state, even national times. But having the community as strong as possible will be important. Providing trusted response, using credible and timely information and data. I'll show you some examples today. Safe, capable and diverse workforces. We heard Kate talk a little bit about the gender the gender issues in the military. I'll talk a little bit about today and show you some trends that we're seeing, and this absolute push for belonging and people feeling included in, feeling safe when they come into a workplace and feeling like they're part of it and welcomed, and the need for us to stand up across the entire sector and to do that. Because we are a broad group of personalities, and we all sit in roles that we don't always necessarily put ourselves in the position of others. And I think that's something that we as a sector need to get really good at. Knowledge, innovation and research, pressuring ourselves to look forward. And I'll talk about some of the work that the Rural Fire Service is doing. I was speaking to some people before lunch and saying, I think if we look back at this stage of development in Australia and fire, that there are a couple of agencies, and New South Wales Rural Fire Service is one of them, that have invested in innovation, that have invested in not thinking about how we're dealing with today's problem, but what are we going to do to push the future. And I think as a nation of emergency services across the country, we'll look back and think New South Wales Rural Fire Service, partly because there's resources there, with Rob Rogers not here and Peter McKechnie leaving me, I can say what I want because none of the other Rural Fire Service will say anything, I'm sure. But they have invested a lot, and we're grateful for that. And I heard Peter talk about Rob's leadership of the Fire Danger Ratings program. He had that when he was Deputy Commissioner, but he wouldn't let it go because of the leadership that was needed to move that through. It's still got some challenges, obviously, the fire danger rating system. We've got some work to do on the science, but the fact that Australia as a nation changed to a new way of communicating fire danger to the community in a simpler way, that's largely because of Rob Rogers finding his way through the federated nation that we call Australia. So fascinating. I can't look at the fire danger rating signs now because of the meetings I went to about the colours and the fonts and how wide the black line had to be between them, and should we have what font should we use for the sign? That's what national consistency got down to for a while. And effective and transparent governance came through. It sounds boring, but how we do our job, how we look at risk in the community, how we manage that risk before it happens and don't just ignore it, I think is important. And one of the things that you'll hear me talk about, if you ever hear me talk, is our sector is good at standing around in a circle and looking at a problem and poking it and standing and harumphing and poking it again and going, oh, this is really annoying. What we're trying to do, and I think every part of the sector needs to do more and more, is say which are the ones we're going to nail and how are we going to do this. We had a great session with all the chiefs and commissioners and senior staff a month ago, where we asked them to put themselves in 2040 and look back and said, what's the legacy that you, as custodians of this sector, as the leaders of this sector at the moment, what's the legacy you leave? What are the things that you're going to do now that can lead to the most, that will save the most lives? And I guarantee, by thinking about putting things in place now that will lead to, in the next generation of emergency services, will have a massive impact on the lives that are saved as disasters get more frequent through the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. But we need to be stepping forward now and embracing technology and embracing different ways of working in the way we escalate disasters. And that's a really hard thing to do, like anything, but it's hard to do. But it's something that we would challenge all of our people, is to let's stop poking the problem, let's stop talking about the problem and think, what are we going to do to fix it? Collaboration, when we do surveys of the AFAC membership, the collaboration network that is run is the most important thing that people come talk to us about. It's where we get experts from each of the agencies on a whole range of different areas. It might be mental health, it might be the shape of an attachment on a fire truck, it might be the techniques for forecasting fire behaviour. But we get the best of the best people from each of the organisations, 33 members, and they come into a room and come up with these, what are the biggest priorities, what are the things that we need to do. In this case, this is a photo of the Alternative and Renewable Energy Technical Group, a fantastic group that through their lobbying provided feedback on a Commonwealth discussion paper about electric vehicles and this push to get more and more electric vehicles into Australia. But they said, well, hang on, what about the safety of first responders? What about how this is new technology? How are we going to keep our first responders safe wherever they are in Australia? And that's led to the Commonwealth Government, just this small piece of lobbying and feedback, that the federal government have put a thread of funding in that will improve training for first responders. As part of not only putting charging infrastructure around, as important, if not more important than the charging infrastructure, is the safety of the people who may have to respond to these electric vehicles in the decades ahead. This will just pop up on the screen, a series of different, I asked my team at work, tell me across all the collaboration groups, what are some of the major things that are coming up that you're talking about, that these groups are talking about in the different areas? 33 groups across a whole wide range of different topics. And hopefully you can still read the grey on there, but they'll just pop up relatively randomly. And it is just so broad. We look across sometimes this sector because we cover the breadth of any individual agency, but then the collective of all those agencies as well. And what flows from all of these collaboration discussions is a national picture or some national doctrine. If you go to the afac.com.au website, you will find a section on doctrine where you can download the industry standard on a whole range of different things, 120 or 150 different areas. So when people go to coroner's court, or when people go to come before an inquiry, on what basis did you make those decisions? I was following some national doctrine or the nationally agreed standard, because we're still learning, as you know, this idea of continuous improvement, we're still learning as we go through. And this is an AFAC's doctrine. It's got an AFAC stamp on it, it's got an AFAC logo on it, but that doctrine doesn't get on the website until it's been signed off by the chiefs and commissioners and senior executives from each of our member agencies. They come together and they have to sign that off. And some is contentious. Some gets handed back and said, no, it's not going to happen. But others become guidelines. But there are some things in there that gives this strength in numbers. And if I describe to people who we are, we create the environment for this force multiplier. That it isn't just looking at 70,000 Rural Fire Service volunteers, it's supporting the CFA volunteers, the Country Fire Service volunteers, the volunteers in DFES, and so on, because there's a collective group at the AFAC conference each year. That so many people have come up to us over the last day and said, I put in for the AFAC conference, when am I finding out? And now that Rob and Peter have left, I'll say that I'm sure that they will pay for everyone in this room to go to the AFAC conference. But it's a fantastic opportunity to bring people in and have these conversations in a similar way. we just signed an MOU with CAVFA, the Council of Australian Volunteer Fire Authorities, which is a really a special thing for us. It's renewed the relationship with CAVFA that we hadn't re-signed for a while. And we were sitting there talking about how we can best work together, because we represent the employers and CAVFA represent the volunteers. But the thing is that we both have this collective good in mind and bringing these groups together. And what we've agreed to do is continue to consult, continue to work with the Volunteer Association and individual volunteer areas. Now, I get in trouble as soon as I say, but if we've upset a group of commissioners, then my tenure as CEO of AFAC will be very, very short. But at the same time, what we are to the chiefs and commissioners can be a critical friend as well in discussing some of these common issues. Recently, the SES Volunteers Association talked to us about a couple of threads of challenges that they were having, either things being done differently in different states or behaviour, some behaviour that they didn't want to come up and shake a cage or anything and say, this is disgusting. They're saying, we just want to be able to find a way that we can penetrate and get this heard amongst the chiefs and commissioners. And I had some great conversations with the relevant chiefs or commissioners, and just to say, and they gave me some advice on what we might be able to do and the messages we can give. And that's the kind of the value that we can have, both an association like this, but also through when we collect that across the country. So we're really grateful that they've for CAVFA to take the leadership role in that and pushing it through as well. So our knowledge sharing, I talked about doctrine already, but another thing obviously is standards. We've done some work recently with the Building Codes Board, who are trying to push through some or lead towards some new standards. And the firefighting fraternity was saying no, that we think there should be a greater emphasis on firefighter safety, whether that be in rural firefighter safety or the urban firefighter safety. And there's a conversation that we have. And that's led to saying, well, yeah, we need more information. So they're investing in some additional research to help us move this through, because it's incredibly community safety, firefighter safety, and the cost of buildings is something that seems to come up quite regularly. We've hit it most recently with some of the tunnel safety work because of some of the safety arrangements in the modern tunnels, that it's costing hundreds of millions of dollars more for people. But that's not quite the politics that I want to get into. The conference I mentioned, then, an exhibition, a wonderful event, not quite to the stature of this event, I'm sorry, but it is a wonderful event. And it's some of the same people that I met in Adelaide last year, next year in Brisbane, or this year in Brisbane, next year in Sydney. And we get about 4,000 delegates, 3,000 to 4,000 delegates through there, a couple of hundred presenters. But it's that same feeling of walking through that I get walking out there, is this energy of gathering people with common ideas together. My first connection with the Rural Fire Service Association was the Rural Fire Service Association was at the ASIFA conference last year, where I got to meet some of you there as well. And just walking through there, and this common sense, in that case, it's about community engagement, and you get the best of the best across your state together trying to nut out these problems and what are we going to do differently. And those little pieces of connections are what changes what we do. And that's why the Federation can be so powerful as well. They often talk about evolution needs a little some kind of deformity or something different for things to evolve and be able to cope in different situations. And this grit and friction that we get from different parts of the Federation and from different types of emergency services agency is where the true innovation comes from. It's where that true next generation of what we do comes from, and just embracing that and recognising sometimes that you actually put a bit of heat into that system and cut through the surface differences. You actually get deeper into what the real nub of some of these problems and hopefully the solutions will be. And many of you may not know that we also run the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience on behalf of the Commonwealth. The old Australian Emergency Management Institute was shut down, and they realised that, we had some things there that we really need. So they went to tender, and AFAC won that tender probably around 2016 to have a knowledge outreach capability through AIDA. And that's gone from strength to strength. It runs its own disaster resilience conference as part of our own conference. But one thing that they do is volunteer leadership a volunteer leadership program that some of you might have been on. The next one's in Wagga, I think in June. They've just extended the nominations for that if people want to nominate it. It's a weekend thing. Accommodations covered for twin share. If you want to stay by yourself, it's an extra $60. And I think we've got something in Newcastle in August. But if you haven't been on it, it's for emergency management volunteers run by the Red Cross, who are our partners in running the Institute for Disaster Resilience. So at our stand, there's a little pamphlet and you can get a QR code, but that's designed to recognise the leadership requirements that are across our volunteer cohorts and the ability who are in the same sector, but perhaps coming from different perspectives. So you can get you can nominate for that, and 1 or 2 a year we have in each state and territory, and that's the Commonwealth investment have maintained that, and they're the ones that cover the accommodation, etc. It's very, very rare that you get the freebies lately and these days. And I just encourage any of you who want to come by and use that QR code and have a look. You can apply and get in this year. Then there's other opportunities, or the people when you go back and share this information. All right, some of the things that we're doing at AFAC around operations, there's been a leap forward in some of that work. The Australian Interagency Incident Management System is effectively owned by AFAC or owned by the council, and AFAC Limited, the company that I'm part of, runs that. And that's a big part of how incidents are run in Australia and the interoperability, and I'll talk about that. It's a professionalisation scheme, the Resource Sharing Centre, I'll talk about that in a second, and also our Aerial Firefighting Centre. All of these under different logos, but people coming in saying, I want to see the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, please. And I take them to the 4 desks that are sitting outside my office, and that's the Aerial Firefighting Centre. But it punches above its weight in terms of the delivery and supporting the sector. Talk about that. So AIMS, don't expect you to read in this case, the text here that's designed to be small, because there's so much involved in trying to document and specify what it takes to run an incident. Now, many of you are involved in incidents and take on these roles regularly. But what's really valuable about the Australian system is that we can slot in, you can go and support your Victorian colleagues or Western Australian colleagues, and they can come and support you. And at least understand the same language, kind of, you'd hope, train to the same levels, and then you can take on roles in different areas. And that likewise, because we're quite similar to the US system, and it's based on the US system, and quite similar to the Canadian system, that we can go over and lock into their areas and keep, and importantly, that's for good decision making and safety of firefighters and all emergency services personnel. But it also allows us to put the lessons learned into future versions of AIMS. We've just embarked, the last one was 2017, and we've been kicking it down the road for a little while. And this year we're just kicking off a review of AIMS, and we'll be going out to all of the agencies to get some people on to look at it and look at where the lessons we've learned. Because what's happened is through 1920, you can't throw such big disasters such as 1920 fires or the subsequent floods without learning things and feeding them back into doctrine and lessons learned across the way. And that's what we're really keen to be doing. It's not ours as such, but we'll update it and it'll be signed off by the AFAC Council. The professionalisation scheme is something that is an extra layer on top of that, I suppose, which is that there's some confronting language that was used about 7 or 8 years ago saying, well, emergency services isn't a profession. And being referred to, and probably still are referred to, as a trade. No, trade's a bad thing. That's the thing. People go, well, I don't mind being referred to as a trade. But it was finding that people weren't necessarily recognising the strength, the technical capability, and the amount of time that people take to keep their skills up. And in the case of the paid workforce, that's on the work time. I can only imagine having a couple of volunteers in my family. I know how much extra time they put in after hours and on weekends to keep things up to date. So there's not a great deal of understanding across our either communities or government just how technically excellent the people in this room are. So the professionalisation scheme was created, which is designed to be not only, it's not a set and forget training, but you have to continue to show that you're keeping up to date with things. and you can build all different types of learning into that. We've only got 1,000 people accredited so far, but we're really keen to look at how to make it more achievable without taking the levels down. Make it achievable, make it relevant to the entire 300,000 workforce. But that gives us some sense of how are we learning and continually not learning things separately. When I was running the Weather Bureau, one of the things I got a big review in around how we were doing lessons learned. I remember that we'd go to a coronial in Queensland about flash flooding, for instance, and services provided. And then a year later, there'd be the similar little issues in operations in New South Wales, and then it'd be Victoria. And this was in the same agency, but they were working independently in different states. And we just recognised the need for us to speed that up, to speed up the learning, the lessons learned, and how we do those, and be really and make sure that when we're doing reviews that it's not a blame review. If we can do these things in a way that it's that we learn from them, but then share them really quickly. And we think this professionalisation scheme might do some of that. The Resource Sharing Centre, previously funded by the states and territories, but over the last year, the Commonwealth has stepped in and co-funded the running of this Resource Sharing Centre. And this is a group that sits within AFAC. And when and regularly speak to Canada, and when Canada ring up and say, oh, things are getting a bit bad here, they've got a network across every state and territory that they start to say, Canada's talking about wanting 300 people or 200 people of these skill sets. And then we can start to put the feelers out. There's a registry that's held of all of the people who are willing and or capable of serving overseas. And then we start that process. So the Resource Sharing Centre builds up a capability to support this sharing. Now, the agencies are the ones that are sharing the resource. And often that might be a handshake between A and B we don't get involved in. But when it gets a bit complex and we're trying to say, should I send this resource from South Australia, does it need to go to Victoria or does it need to go to New South Wales in a big fire event? Then this Resource Sharing Centre can support and put the information in front of the chiefs and commissioners, and those decisions can be made. They can also support, as happened this year, after the Western Australians crashed the large air tanker, the national large air tanker. We're not sending it back there, by the way, the next one. But New South Wales and Victoria stood up and said, well, we will donate one of our large air tankers for the rest of the summer, and we'll share that. We will allow it to be shared. And then Western Australia rang up wanting another large air tanker, and South Australia wanted it on the same day because weather's typically here moves from west to east. And we called together a meeting and said, right, ParaFest said, well, I don't want to have to it's not my place to make a decision on whether Western Australia is more at risk or South Australia. So we pull together, we facilitate a meeting of the Chief Officers Committee, and they come together and they discuss where the threat is, how we might be able to time and get the best of both worlds. And then Rural Fire Service has the backing of this Chief Officers and Commissioners. And it is a remarkably collegiate. It's remarkably collegiate from the point of view of New South Wales always will prioritise the people of New South Wales, but they also recognise that that they'll be in a position when others need to help them. And this gives you a sense in the last little while, it's all been flood, far more flood than we've ever done before, but it's only just around the corner when the fire side of things goes as well. All right, the Canadian wildfires, some of you might have got word of the people over there sending back, being trained on how to avoid grizzly bears or whatever types of bears. It's a remarkable thing that firefighters in Australia do and emergency services personnel do. But we had 221 personnel go over there, living pretty rough, many of them, and then another 140 come through, and pretty remarkable it's this early. We haven't even tapped into what might happen in the US yet. And they were talking about a late season because of all the snow, etc. But this has been remarkably early, and it's something that we have to be mindful of in terms of what comes for us. Lots of fuel out there still, and what comes for Australia as we get through whatever off season we have left in Australia these days. But we're certainly looking to that spring period closely. The firefighting centre, some of the things that we're involved in there. The promoting safety, number one. We're getting lots and lots of contact at the moment, both with the ATSB, because of the two large air tanker crashes that we've seen in the last few years, and wanting to improve the safety for pilots, but also for people on the ground as well. And it's one of those really difficult things that these are dangerous situations for the community, and you have to weigh up risk to community versus a risk to the emergency services, as happens all the time in your day-to-day world. But this focus on safety is really important. We're a force multiplier for the procurement. Instead of every state and territory having their own procurement arms, we support by having a procurement capability in AFAC that can do these bulk recruitments on behalf of the agencies. RFS is the furthest ahead in terms of owning their aircraft, but I really feel that as the future goes, the kind of costs that we're seeing coming through for the large air tankers in particular, and just the availability, that there'll be more and more of that national capability if we want to be able to cover the length of the fire season. Keep moving. A really interesting project, because the federal government, they give the states and territories around $30 million a year to do firefighting operations. That took a big leap after the 1925s. It was sitting around 16 to 18 million, I think, went up to about 30 million a year. But that's only about 20% of what states and territories pay. So it's not a Commonwealth funded operation. Commonwealth support it when it gets into the disaster recovery phase, that they might also end up paying for some of the operations of aircraft. But the states and territories, because they're responsible for the firefighting efforts, will pay for a lot of that. But what the government said is, we'll give you $30 million a year for a few years to states and territories, but we want you to go and look at what is the right size for the Australian aerial firefighting fleet, both in terms of the different types of aircraft, but also the mix of locally owned. We want to push a local industry if we can, and that's really difficult. Different states have different budgets, different states have different risk profiles, etc. So we're doing some work with the Natural Hazards Research Australia around looks at how aircraft are best used in different landscapes, both just talking to experts around the country, but also looks at whether the aircraft have been effective, both from a local point of view, but also a state point of view. This isn't to say aircraft aren't effective. This isn't to say to provide that value proposition. It's just about to give information to the decision makers, and this is what we know about aircraft now, and then they can make decisions about the risk profile. And then we can get sharing arrangements, such as in Queensland, there's a large air tanker that comes in and does the early season, and that same large air tanker travels down to Victoria for the back end of the season. Best of both worlds, because the seasons don't overlap. We can do that for a while, but pretty soon they're overlapping. All right, 4 minutes. Okay. Some of the things that we have been involved in: improved public safety, obviously the fire danger rating system, supporting the project management of that on behalf of the Rural Fire Service. The Australian warning system, another thing that came from the community coming back and saying, we're all using different language, we don't know what to do. And ultimately, I say about emergency communications, it's a marketing problem. We're trying to change community behaviour. So how do we have to put it in a language that the community can digest at times of stress? So simple messaging, action-oriented messaging is absolutely vital, and the Australian warning system does that. We've got a long way to go in terms of getting the way the flood side is implemented to align with the way that the fire side is implemented. So when you see an emergency warning for flood and fire, there's the same feeling. But it's there, at least there's an agreement to use the terminology and a commitment from all of the agencies to work together to solve it. We work on the seasonal bushfire outlook that we've issued. A seasonal flood outlook we hope is coming, and lots of education for young people that comes through the Institute for Disaster Resilience, but also some of our collaboration groups as well. And there's no doubt some of you talking at the Community Education Conference, speaking to people at that last year, that sense in your communities and the roles that you have in schools and education facilities. Hopefully there's some more resources that we might be able to produce that can support you in doing that. Around diversity and inclusion, a long way to go. A male-dominated sector, which, for right or wrong, there are some people that will struggle in the environment, and actually, for wrong, people will struggle in the environment. So there's a bit of work done. The AFAC agencies formed a Champions of Change fire and emergency group that is supposed to accelerate gender equity. We do have a long way to go in terms of some of our stats. Being part of this is you have to put your stats up from each agency. So some of these might be, they probably don't cover the full volunteer workforce. They're more the paid workforce, but we be given the length and breadth and the size of the volunteer workforce, we've got a bit of time to go. But over 5 years, women's representation across the sector, 22% to 26%. Woohoo, I hear you say. A wonderful thing. Lots of work to go. Senior executives, 27 to 33. General manager roles, 25 to 37. But on frontline delivery, we've gone backwards in some areas. Frontline service delivery, we've gone backwards. And we need to get on top of that to understand why that's happening, because we say, well, we shouldn't just focus on gender, we should focus on general inclusion. But what it's a marker for is that we need this is a marker for many other types of limited diversity we've got, because it will lead to better decisions if we can improve that. The two things we're focusing on: women in frontline roles, so barriers, understanding what the barriers to career progression are and progression through, what are the barriers stopping people from joining, but also general everyday respect. Create an environment where all people are welcome when they walk in. If they walk into a particular part of an area or a brigade, that they're welcome, that they're part of a community that goes beyond that brigade, and that's a really important thing for us. I'm going to skip through that. This one was interesting because this gives you a sense of the paid workforce, but I heard Peter talk today about the Rural Fire Service having a large young cohort coming through. One of the challenges we've got that we're seeing in the sector is typically the sector is ageing. No offence to those of you who are ageing like we all are, but the blue line there is the percent of people who were less than 30 years. So going back to 2014-15, probably across the paid workforce, 12% of people less than 30 years, now down to 9%. Percent of people over 60 years were at 5% and now are at 9%. That's not a great trend. That's not a great trend to be looking at in terms of of how we both capture knowledge of the people who are at the back end of their careers, but also bring new people in with innovative ideas and different ways of thinking. But this is societal. This is what's happening in society anyway, as they do predictions on what the ageing of our population will look like. And that's what we have to get inside when we think about diversity as well. A few current initiatives. The Rural Fire Services are leading a really fantastic initiative around not only looking at the threat of weather and fuel in the community, but also what if we could understand what the likelihood of ignition from lightning, power lines or arson is? What about the ability of our suppression based on where our equipment is in a particular area and the impact? And we can start not only tailoring language that comes from the fire danger rating system to weather, but what about the community underneath that as well? And that way you can imagine different communities who are better prepared might respond differently to messaging, or we might use different types of messaging or different media in different communities. And this has got some funding out of the Commonwealth and co-contributions from state and territory. Spark, you might have heard of bushfire simulations. I'm going to go through this really quickly. That you basically put a point source in, it uses the physics and predicts where the fire will be. The beauty of this is there a new national simulator that's being launched that allows you to not only look at one single output, but a range of outputs that allows you to look at what's the probability of this happening. This is modelling. After spending a career following weather models in forecasting, it's one possible outcome, but it's a tool that decision support people that can be used to create better decisions and to visualise, which is really important for people, particularly young people who are coming in who may not have seen these things before. And of course, it's got pretty smart Ember transport as well, which is really important to visualise and play the what if game that might help you to build scenarios. So this will be available to fire behaviour analysts around the country to replace some of the more antiquated capability. And interestingly, on the next slide, it's smart enough to know where the barriers are. You can put boundaries of a burn that you've put in, or a river will hold things up as well. And you can talk about the strength and the width of that to give a sense of when the fire will go over. It's science. It may not always be reality, or it's a version of science. Big piece of work coming through Natural Hazards Research Australia is around volunteer sustainability. There was a Workforce 2030 thing that was done, and most groups said, we're sick of talking about this. We want to see tangible action. So they're working on it's been driven by volunteer agencies and associations to saying, let's design a project that will not only reimagine the volunteering challenges and solutions. So sit down, what are some of the things we haven't thought of yet to retain and to make it a really fulfilling environment? Look at the best of current practice and think about what we might do. Also research that will help the sector look at some of the innovative ways of working, to look at beyond sometimes some of the tradition into new ways of working and new ways of thinking, and develop some form of a blueprint that we can look at. Now, the volunteer associations are involved in this, volunteer advocates are involved in this, so it's going to be a really inclusive process, and we're really interested in understanding, because the volunteers will remain the heart of our response. We recently gave evidence at a Senate inquiry that talked really a lot about what if we do if the defence isn't there? We need a second arm of defence. We can call on 250,000 volunteers in Australia. At its best, Defence will call on about 70 or 80,000, really different types of skills, and they're fantastic. But we have to find ways to invest more in that volunteer workforce, because the whole of Australia's response is built on it.